On March 14, 1979, Carl Denton walked into Hoffman Farm Equipment in Warwick County, Indiana, and signed his name 23 times. He was 26 years old. The tractor sitting in the showroom behind him was a Massey Ferguson 2745, painted in that deep red that caught light differently than any other machine on the lot. It had 165 horsepower, a cab with air conditioning, and a price tag that made the dealer hesitate before sliding the contract across the desk. Carl had been farming his father-in-law's land for 4 years. He had 280 acres under lease, a wife who was 7 months pregnant, and a belief that the future belonged to men willing to borrow against it. He bought the tractor on full credit, 0 down. Payments stretched across 7 years. When he drove it off the lot that afternoon, the dealer stood in the doorway and watched until the red paint disappeared around the county road bend. Carl thought it was respect. It wasn't. The newspaper ran a story 3 days later. Local boy makes good. They called him the youngest farmer in county history to buy a brand new tractor of that size on his own signature. His picture ran below the headline. He stood beside the Massey Ferguson with his arms crossed, squinting slightly in the March sun, trying to look older than he was. His father-in-law, Eugene, clipped the article and put it in a drawer without comment. His wife, Linda, taped it to the refrigerator. That picture would stay there for 9 months. By the time she took it down, the paper had yellowed and curled at the edges, and Carl had stopped looking at it. Carl had grown up on a farm that didn't belong to his family. His father worked land owned by a man in Louisville who visited twice a year and never stepped out of his Lincoln. Carl learned early that ownership was the only thing that mattered. You could work yourself sick on someone else's dirt and wake up one morning to find out they'd sold it without telling you. That happened when Carl was 17. His father aged a decade in a weekend. They moved to a smaller rented house near the edge of the county, and Carl's father spent the next 6 years driving a propane delivery truck. He died of a heart attack in the cab at 51. Carl was 22. He swore at the funeral that he'd never work land he didn't control, never operate equipment that couldn't be his, never let some man in a city decide his future. 4 years later, he signed for the Massey Ferguson. It felt like the first decision he'd ever made that his father would have been proud of. Eugene didn't see it that way. Eugene had married his daughter to Carl because Carl was steady, quiet, and willing to work for a wage that didn't require negotiation. The deal was simple. Carl farmed Eugene's 280 acres, kept 30% of the crop revenue, and paid rent on a small house at the eastern edge of the property. Eugene provided the equipment, a 40-year-old Massey Ferguson 175, a disc, a plow, and a grain wagon that hadn't held paint since 1968. It was enough. Carl made it work, but Eugene's equipment was dying in pieces, and Carl had started talking about what would happen when the 175 finally quit. Eugene's answer was always the same. We'll figure it out when it happens. Carl figured it out on his own. He didn't tell Eugene about the loan until the day the tractor was delivered. Eugene had been in the barn fixing a gate latch when he heard the diesel engine throttle down in the driveway. He stepped outside and saw the Massey Ferguson 2745 idling in front of the equipment shed, new enough that the exhaust still smelled like factory cosmoline. Carl was standing beside it with his hands in his pockets. Eugene walked over slowly, stopped about 10 feet away, and asked what the hell Carl thought he was doing. Carl said he'd bought a tractor. Eugene asked with what money. Carl said payments. Eugene said payments on whose crop. Carl didn't answer, and that silence explained everything. Eugene turned and walked back into the barn. He didn't come out for the rest of the day. Linda tried to smooth it over that night. She told Carl that her father just needed time, that he'd come around once he saw how much more efficient the new tractor was, that men like Eugene didn't like surprises, but they respected results. Carl wanted to believe her. He spent the next week running that Massey Ferguson across every field Eugene owned, plowing straighter rows than the land had seen in a generation, turning soil twice as fast as the old 175 ever could. He thought the work would speak for itself. But Eugene didn't say a word. He watched from the porch, from the barn door, from the cab of his pickup truck parked along the road. He watched, and he didn't speak, and Carl began to realize that silence wasn't the same thing as approval. The first payment came due in June, $473. Carl had projected his share of the crop revenue and knew he could cover it with room to spare, assuming the yields held and the grain prices stayed stable. Both assumptions were reasonable in the spring of 1979. By autumn, neither was true. Grain prices had started slipping in August. Not a collapse, just a slow downward drift that made every futures contract feel like a gamble. Carl sold his share of the harvest in October and cleared the first two payments with about $200 left over. He told Linda it was fine. She asked if he was sure. He said yes. He wasn't sure. By January of 1980, the economy had started turning in ways that didn't make sense to people who worked dirt for a living. Interest rates were climbing. Inflation was eating value faster than crops could generate it. The cost of fuel, seed, and fertilizer had jumped 20% in 8 months. Carl ran the numbers every night at the kitchen table, writing figures in a notebook that he kept in the drawer beside the sink. The payments on the Massey Ferguson hadn't changed, but everything around them had. In March of 1980, he missed a payment for the first time. He called the dealer and explained the situation. They said they understood and that they'd work with him. He made it up in April by selling a piece of equipment his father had left him, a small grain auger that he'd been saving in case he ever bought his own land. It fetched $320. He mailed the check the same day. Eugene found out about the missed payment because the dealer's finance manager mentioned it during a conversation at the feed mill. Eugene didn't say anything to Carl directly. He said it to Linda. He told her that Carl was driving them into a hole, that the tractor was a mistake, that men who leveraged their futures on equipment they didn't need ended up losing everything they thought they had. Linda defended Carl, but her voice didn't carry the certainty it used to. She asked Carl that night if they were going to be okay. Carl said yes. She asked if he was lying. He said no. She didn't ask again. The spring of 1981 broke something in the wider farm economy that had been bending for 2 years. Land values dropped, banks tightened. Farms that had been operating on thin equity found themselves underwater without ever making a bad decision. It was just math turning against people who'd believed the math was stable. Carl planted that year with borrowed seed on credit terms that made his stomach ache. The Massey Ferguson ran perfectly. Every system worked exactly the way the manual said it would. The engine fired cold every morning. The hydraulics responded smooth. The cab stayed cool, even in August heat. It was the best piece of equipment Carl had ever operated, and it was killing him. He missed 3 payments between May and September of 1981. The dealer stopped returning his calls. In October, a letter arrived from a law office in Evansville. It used words like default and repossession and breach of contract. Carl read it twice, folded it into quarters, and put it in the drawer with his payment notebook. He didn't tell Linda. She found it a week later while looking for a pen. She didn't cry. She just set it on the table in front of him and asked what he was going to do. He said he didn't know. She said her father had been right. Carl didn't argue. On November 18, 1981, 2 men arrived in a flatbed truck with a county logo on the door. They had a court order authorizing the repossession of one Massey Ferguson 2745 tractor, serial number matching the contract Carl had signed 31 months earlier. Carl met them in the driveway. He'd been expecting them for 3 weeks. He handed over the keys without a word, watched them load the tractor onto the flatbed, using the same ramps he'd driven it down the day it was delivered. The men were professional. They didn't make small talk. They secured the chains, checked the load twice, and drove away. The whole process took 20 minutes. Linda watched from the kitchen window. Eugene watched from the barn. By noon, half the county knew. The auction notice appeared in the Warwick County Register 2 weeks later. Public sale. Farm equipment. Defaulted loan recovery. The Massey Ferguson 2745 was listed third in a column of tractors, combines, and backhoes being sold to recover creditor losses. The auction was set for December 12th at the dealer lot. Carl didn't plan to attend, but Eugene told him he should. Eugene said a man who runs from his failures stays a failure. Carl didn't know if that was advice or cruelty, but he went. There were 60 people at the auction. Carl recognized most of them. Farmers he'd known his entire life, men who'd bought him drinks at weddings, neighbors who'd helped him pull a truck out of a ditch one February during an ice storm. They didn't look at him. The auctioneer worked through the smaller items first. A disc harrow went for $800. A grain auger sold for $250. When the Massey Ferguson rolled into the center of the lot, the auctioneer spent 30 seconds describing its features and condition before opening the bidding at $12,000. The tractor had cost Carl $19,000 new. Someone bid $12,500. Someone else went $13,000. The auctioneer called it sold at $14,000, $200 to a farmer Carl had never met from a county 40 miles south. The whole thing took 4 minutes. Carl stood near the back with his hands in his coat pockets and watched the man who bought it climb into the cab, start the engine, and drive it onto a trailer. The tractor looked exactly the same as the day Carl had brought it home. It didn't care who owned it. Eugene was waiting in the truck when Carl walked back across the gravel lot. He didn't say anything on the drive home. Linda had dinner ready when they arrived. She'd made pot roast, and the house smelled like onions and black pepper. They ate without talking. After dinner, Carl went out to the barn and sat on an overturned bucket in the dark for 2 hours. When he came back inside, Linda was in bed. He stood in the doorway and told her he was sorry. She said she knew. He asked if she wanted him to leave. She said no. He asked why not. She said because leaving wouldn't fix anything. The repo auction became a story people told. Not with meanness, exactly, but with the kind of inevitability that made it useful as a lesson. Carl Denton was the young man who overreached, who bought equipment he couldn't afford, who thought credit was the same thing as wealth. The newspaper never ran a follow-up article. There was no local boy recovers headline. Carl became a reference point. When someone else in the county talked about buying equipment on credit, someone would mention Carl Denton and what happened to that Massey Ferguson, and the conversation would end. Eugene let Carl keep farming the 280 acres, but the terms changed. Carl's share of the crop dropped to 20%. Eugene bought a used Massey Ferguson 230 from an estate sale and told Carl was what he'd be operating. The 230 was 30 years old, leaked hydraulic fluid, and had a steering system that required constant correction. Carl didn't complain. He worked that tractor for the next 18 months, and when the clutch finally gave out in the spring of 1983, Eugene decided it wasn't worth fixing. He told Carl the arrangement wasn't working anymore. He told Carl he'd need to find something else. Carl was 29 years old. He had a wife, a 4-year-old daughter, and no prospects. He took a job at the Alcoa plant in Newburgh. 3rd shift, assembly line work, 42 hours a week at $9 an hour. Linda got a job at the elementary school as a secretary. Between the two incomes, they kept the house, barely. Carl worked the plant for 3 years and hated every night of it. The noise, the fluorescent lights, the way time moved differently when you were building the same component 500 times in a row. He'd come home at 7 in the morning, sleep until 2 in the afternoon, and wake up feeling like he'd aged in his sleep. Linda would be at work. His daughter would be at school. He'd sit at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that tasted like aluminum and stare out the window at land he used to farm. In 1984, a man named Russell Calls came to Carl's house on a Saturday afternoon. Russell farmed 600 acres on the other side of the county and ran a custom harvesting operation during the fall. He'd heard Carl wasn't farming anymore and wanted to know if Carl had any equipment sitting around that he might be willing to part with. Carl said he didn't. Russell asked if he was sure, because he'd heard Carl used to run a newer Massey Ferguson, and sometimes parts from those machines could be useful even if the tractor itself was gone. Carl said the tractor had been repossessed 3 years ago. Russell nodded and said he knew, but he was wondering if Carl had kept anything from it, any parts, any pieces. Carl had kept one thing. When the repossession men had loaded the Massey Ferguson onto the flatbed, Carl had been in the barn disconnecting the tractor's auxiliary hydraulic pump. It was a small component, about the size of a bread box, that controlled the remote hydraulic lines used for running attachments. Carl had installed it himself a month after buying the tractor, and it wasn't listed on the original equipment manifest. Technically, it didn't belong to the creditor. Technically, it was his. He'd wrapped it in an old tarp and stored it on a shelf in Eugene's barn, and then later moved it to his own garage when he and Linda rented the house in town. He'd never planned to use it. He just couldn't let it go. Russell offered Carl $200 for the hydraulic pump. Carl said it wasn't for sale. Russell asked what Carl planned to do with it. Carl didn't have an answer. Russell said he understood and left his number in case Carl changed his mind. Carl didn't call. But 2 months later, a different farmer showed up. Then another one, 3 weeks after that. Word had gotten around that Carl Denton had a hydraulic pump from a Massey Ferguson 2745, and for farmers running older Massey equipment, that component was gold. It was compatible with a half-dozen different models, hard to find and expensive to buy new. Carl started getting calls. He still said no. In November of 1985, a farmer named Gene Hafford knocked on Carl's door at 9 o'clock at night. Gene was 71 years old, ran a small dairy operation, and was 3 days into a breakdown on his Massey Ferguson 255. The tractor's hydraulic system had failed in the middle of feeding, and Gene had 60 head of cattle waiting on hay that couldn't be moved without a working loader. Gene had called every dealer and parts supplier within 80 miles. Nobody had the pump he needed, and ordering one would take 2 weeks. Gene had heard about Carl's pump. He wasn't asking to buy it, he was asking to borrow it, just long enough to get his loader working again. He'd return it within a week. Carl said yes. He pulled the pump off the shelf, wiped 3 years of dust off the tarp, and handed it to Gene. Gene asked what he owed. Carl said nothing. Gene said that didn't seem right. Carl said it was fine. Gene took the pump, installed it the next morning, got his cattle fed, and returned it to Carl 6 days later with a $100 bill tucked inside the tarp. Carl tried to give the money back. Gene wouldn't take it. He said Carl had saved his operation, and that was worth something. 3 weeks later, another farmer called, then another. Carl started lending out the hydraulic pump the way some people lend out tools. He never charged. If someone offered money, he'd take it, but he never asked. Most people paid something, $20, $50, whatever they thought was fair. Carl kept the money in a coffee can in the garage. By the end of 1986, the can had $400 in it. By the end of 1987, it had $900. Carl didn't advertise. He didn't put up signs or take out ads in the weekly paper. But in a county where everyone knew everyone, word spread in the way it always does. If you ran Massey Ferguson equipment and something broke, you called Carl Denton. He'd either have the part you needed, or he'd know how to jury-rig a solution that would get you through the season. He worked out of his garage. He charged almost nothing. Sometimes he charged actually nothing. Farmers started showing up on weekends with hydraulic lines that needed replacing, PTO shafts that had sheared, electrical systems that didn't make sense anymore. Carl would look at the problem, disappear into the garage, and come back with something that worked. He didn't talk much while he worked. He didn't need to. By 1990, Carl had quit the Alcoa plant. He was making more money fixing equipment than he'd ever made farming. It wasn't wealth, it was survival. But it was his, and it didn't belong to a bank or a creditor or a father-in-law who'd watched him fail. Linda asked him once if he missed farming. He said no. She asked if he was lying. He said yes. The hydraulic pump became something else over the years. It wasn't just a component anymore. It was proof that Carl had once owned something worth repossessing. Farmers who used it understood what it represented. A piece of a machine that Carl had lost, kept alive by being useful to people who hadn't lost theirs yet. It got borrowed 70, 80, maybe 100 times over the next decade. Carl stopped counting. He just kept it clean, kept it wrapped, and kept it available. In 1995, a man named Von Trask brought his son into Carl's garage. The son was 19, planning to take over the family farm, and Von wanted him to meet Carl. Von told the story about the time Carl's hydraulic pump had saved his harvest in 1987 when a dealer couldn't get him a part for 3 weeks. Von said Carl had driven it out to the farm himself, installed it in the rain, and refused payment. The son shook Carl's hand and said he'd heard a lot about him. Carl didn't know what to say to that, so he didn't say anything. After they left, Linda asked Carl why he'd never told her that story. Carl said he didn't think it mattered. Linda said it did. The requests kept coming. Farmers Carl had known his whole life. Farmers he'd never met. Young men just starting out who'd heard there was someone in the county who'd help you if you were in trouble. Carl helped when he could. He said no when he couldn't. Nobody seemed to hold it against him either way. There was an understanding. Carl wasn't running a charity, but he also wasn't running a business. He was just a man with a part that people needed and a willingness to share it. In 1998, Eugene had a stroke. It was mild enough that he survived, severe enough that he couldn't farm anymore. He sold the 280 acres to a development company out of Indianapolis. The buyer planned to subdivide it into residential lots. Eugene made $400,000 on the sale. He moved into a managed care facility near Evansville and didn't speak to Carl again before he died in 2001. Linda inherited $16,000. They used it to pay off the mortgage on their house. Carl kept fixing equipment. His daughter graduated high school in 1999, went to Indiana University, and came back with a degree in education. She got a job teaching 6th grade in the same school where Linda worked. In 2003, she married a man who worked IT for the county government. They didn't farm. Carl didn't expect them to. Then, in the summer of 2008, the economy collapsed in ways that reminded Carl of 1981, except faster and meaner. The housing market imploded. Credit froze. People who thought they had equity discovered they had debt with a different name. In Warwick County, 3 farms went into foreclosure between October and December. One of them belonged to Gene Hafford's son, who'd taken over the dairy operation after Gene passed in 2004. The son had borrowed against rising land values to expand the herd, and when milk prices dropped and credit disappeared, the operation folded in 4 months. The farm went to auction in January of 2009. Carl heard about it from Russell Calls, who'd stayed in touch over the years. Russell said the Hafford auction was going to be ugly. The bank was selling everything: land, equipment, livestock. The son was losing a farm his family had operated since 1946. Russell said it reminded him of the 80s, except worse, because people had forgotten that this kind of thing could still happen. The auction was held on a Saturday in late January, cold enough that the auctioneer's breath came out in clouds. There were 120 people standing in the mud outside the Hafford barn. Carl was one of them. He didn't plan to bid. He just wanted to see it. The land sold first, 460 acres in 3 parcels. A development group from Louisville bought 2 of them. A farmer from Spencer County bought the 3rd. The equipment came next: tractors, combines, a skid steer, a flatbed truck. The Massey Ferguson 255 that Gene had operated for 30 years sold for $6,200. Carl watched a man he didn't recognize loaded onto a trailer. After the equipment, they sold the house and outbuildings separately from the land. The house went to an investor who planned to rent it out. But before the auctioneer could close the sale, a man in the back raised his hand and asked if the property items could be purchased separately. The auctioneer said it depended on what he wanted. The man said the barn. He wanted to buy just the barn, dismantle it, and move it. The auctioneer conferred with the bank representative. They said no. The structures sold with the land. Carl left before the auction finished. He sat in his truck in the parking lot and watched people load equipment, shake hands, drive away. It looked exactly like the auction in 1981, except he wasn't the one losing everything this time. He wasn't sure if that made it better or worse. 2 months later, Russell Calls called Carl and said he needed to come by the garage. He had something to talk about. Russell showed up on a Wednesday afternoon with 5 other men. Carl recognized all of them. Farmers he'd helped over the years. Von Trask, Gene Hafford's nephew, a man named Perry who ran corn and soy up near Boonville. They stood in Carl's driveway, and Russell did the talking. Russell said they'd been meeting, talking about the Hafford auction and what it meant that farms were still disappearing the same way they had 30 years ago. Talking about how nobody helped each other the way they used to. Talking about Carl, Russell said Carl had spent 25 years keeping people going when they had no reason to expect help. The hydraulic pump had been borrowed or used in repairs on maybe 15 different farms over the years, and every one of those farmers remembered. Russell said they wanted to do something. The Hafford farm had sold, but the son still owed money. The land sale hadn't covered the full debt, and the bank was coming after the remainder. The son was looking at bankruptcy and a lien that would follow him for a decade. Russell said the group had pooled money, $18,000 between the six of them. They wanted to pay off the son's remaining debt and clear him. But they also wanted to do something else. Gene Hafford's original farm, the one his family had started in 1946, had been subdivided twice over the years. The core 80 acres, the part with the original farmhouse and barn, had sold to the development group. But Russell had called them, made an offer, bought the 80 acres back at a small markup. Russell said the group wanted to deed that land to Carl's daughter, not to Carl, to his daughter. Free and clear. No mortgage, no strings. The title would transfer directly. She could sell it, farm it, or leave it empty. It didn't matter. What mattered was that Carl had kept people running for 25 years without asking for anything, and this was the payment they should have made a long time ago. Carl said no. He said he couldn't accept that. Russell said it wasn't Carl's choice. The deed was already drawn. The land was going to Carl's daughter, whether Carl liked it or not. Vaughn said Carl had saved his farm in 1987. Perry said Carl had kept him solvent in 1993 when a combine broke and no dealer could get parts in time. Gene's nephew said Carl had refused payment so many times that the family had kept a list of debts they figured they owed, and this didn't even come close to settling it. Carl asked why they were doing this. Russell said because the whole town had watched Carl fail in 1981, and nobody did a damn thing to stop it. Russell said Carl had spent 25 years making sure that when other people failed, they didn't fail alone. Russell said this was the town watching Carl succeed for once. The land transferred in April of 2009. Carl's daughter and her husband moved into the original Hafford farmhouse that summer. They didn't farm the land. They leased it to a neighbor who planted corn and paid a modest rent. The income wasn't much, but it was stable. In 2012, Carl's daughter had a son. In 2015, she had a daughter. The kids grew up playing in the barn that Gene Hafford had built in 1953. Carl kept the hydraulic pump in his garage. He still lent it out. Less often now because the equipment it fit was aging out of use, but occasionally someone would call and Carl would pull it off the shelf, wipe off the dust, and hand it over. He never charged. People still paid. In 2017, Carl turned 64. Linda retired from the school. They started talking about what came next. Carl said he didn't know. Linda said that was fine. She said they'd spent 36 years not knowing, and it had worked out better than either of them expected. One afternoon in October of 2018, Carl was in the garage when a truck pulled into the driveway. A man in his 50s stepped out, looked around, and asked if this was where Carl Denton worked. Carl said it was. The man said his name was Michael. He'd just bought a farm up near Elberfeld and inherited a Massey Ferguson 240 that had a hydraulic issue. Someone told him Carl might be able to help. Carl asked what the problem was. Michael described it. Carl said he'd need to see it. Michael said he could bring it by. 3 days later, Michael returned with the 240 on a trailer. Carl spent an hour looking at it, tracing lines, checking pressures. The problem was a failed valve in the remote hydraulic circuit. Carl said he didn't have the part, but he had something that might work temporarily. He disappeared into the garage and came back with the hydraulic pump, the one from the Massey Ferguson 2745, the one he'd pulled 37 years ago before the repo men came. He installed it in Michael's 240. It fit. The system pressurized. The hydraulics worked. Michael asked what he owed. Carl said nothing. Michael said that didn't seem right. Carl said the pump had been borrowed 100 times and it always came back. He said Michael could return it when he was done, or he could keep it if he needed it. Michael asked if Carl was sure. Carl said yes. Michael drove away with the pump still installed. Carl watched the trailer disappear down the road. Linda came out of the house and asked if Carl was okay. He said he was fine. She asked if he was lying. He said no. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't. The pump never came back. Carl didn't call to ask about it. He assumed Michael either still needed it or had forgotten. It didn't matter. The pump had done what it was supposed to do. It had kept something running. Carl's daughter still owns the 80 acres. Her son is 12 now. He talks sometimes about farming when he's older, the way kids do when they don't yet understand what it costs. Carl doesn't discourage him. He doesn't encourage him either. He just listens. On March 14, 2024, 45 years to the day after Carl signed for the Massey Ferguson 2745, he sat on his porch and thought about all the decisions he'd made that seemed like mistakes at the time. The tractor, the debt, the failure, the humiliation, the years spent fixing other people's equipment instead of farming his own land. He thought about the hydraulic pump, wherever it was now, still working in some machine he'd never see again. He thought about his daughter's land, about the farmers who'd pooled their money, about Gene Hafford borrowing a part at 9 o'clock at night, about Russell calling it payment. He thought about the newspaper clipping that Linda had taped to the refrigerator in 1979, the one that called him the future of farming. He'd thrown that clipping away in 1982. He wished now that he'd kept it, not because it was right, but because it was wrong in a way that led somewhere he hadn't expected. The whole town had watched him fail. And then, slowly, without announcing it, the whole town had carried him forward anyway. Not out of pity, out of something else. Something that didn't have a name but had the weight of 30 years behind it. Carl didn't know if the Massey Ferguson 2045 still existed. It could be scrapped by now, sold for parts, rusting in a field somewhere. It didn't matter. The machine was gone, but the consequences weren't. They were still here. In his daughter's land, in the farmers who called him when something broke, in a hydraulic pump that had been borrowed so many times it didn't belong to him anymore. It belonged to the county. He sat on the porch until the sun dropped below the tree line, and when Linda came out to ask if he wanted dinner, he said yes. They went inside. The house was warm. The mortgage was paid. His daughter lived on land that nobody could take from her. It wasn't the future Carl had imagined in 1979, but it was the one he'd built, piece by piece, from the wreckage of the one he'd lost.